Hi, I'm Stefan from Mix66, and if you struggle to get a great sounding crispy vocal, then you are at the right place. Because in this video I will show you 5 problem areas that almost every vocal has, and obviously the solution to that problem. So what are the most common problems that vocal recordings have? The first one is that they are out of tune. The second one is that they have too much low end, so they sound too dull. The third thing is that they are too dynamic, so we need to control the dynamics of the vocal. The next thing is that the sibilance can be too harsh, while the airy top end is missing, so I count that as one problem. And the last thing is that they lack ambience. If you think about it, a vocal microphone is usually up close to the mouth of the singer, but how often do you talk with somebody or you hear somebody sing that close to your ear? Almost never. In some genres, for example hip hop, it is great to have a dry vocal, but usually for most genres you want a vocal with at least a little bit of ambience. So we will take a look at these 5 problem areas using a recording of my new YouTube band or YouTube project, Punk Rock Echoes, a project I started a few months ago with my dear friend Philip. And last month we covered Blink-182's Anthem Part 2, so we'll take a look at the vocal recording from that cover. So here we have the vocal recording. I disabled all the processing and I muted the reverb send. So let's hear the raw vocal recording.
We really need to see this through. We never want it.
And as you can hear, the vocal doesn't sound too bad. It sounds great actually for a raw vocal recording. This was recorded with a Shure SM7B, so one of the best, or maybe it's not the best, but one of the most used vocal microphones out there, especially in heavier genres. So the vocal itself sounds alright. And regarding our first problem area, so the tuning, I have to say that Philip is a great singer. So there is not a lot of work needed. And in that case, I will just throw an automatic tuner on the vocal. If the singer is not that great, or if you want to have the vocal really in tune, so in our case this is a punk rock cover for YouTube, so our goal was not to have a perfect clean recording, so we can also live with some maybe out of tune vocals. But if you want to have pitch perfect vocals, then you will need to use some manual graphic tuner like Melodyne, or I mean, there are so many out there, you will surely find one that suits your workflow. So in our case, let's enable the plugins. The first plugin in our chain is Reattune from Reaper with the automatic pitch correction. The key is set to C major as the song is, and the attack time is 250 milliseconds, so fairly slow, to make sure that we don't get these weird share-like tuning artifacts. Reattune has also a manual correction mode, so a graphical tuning interface where you can manually correct every note. This is not as precise as Melodyne, for example, but also if you need to tune the vocal a little bit more, this is a great tool. But as I said, for a great singer like Philip, some automatic pitch correction with a slow attack time is more than enough, just to tune some notes that were not perfectly on pitch. Our second problem area was the low end or the low mids. So usually a vocal range starts at 100 Hz for males and 200 Hz for females. So usually you can get rid of anything below that right away. That's why I'm always using a low cut filter, but a low cut filter usually is not enough due to the proximity effect to the microphone. So the closer you get to a directional microphone, the more low end buildup you have. So low end and lower mids. And that usually is too much for vocal recording. To get a great vocal recording, you usually want to get as close as possible to the microphone, because then you have a cleaner recording, with less room interferences. But again, you have more proximity effect, which means the low end and low mids are building up. That's not a big problem. We can get rid of that with an EQ. In my case, I just used an instance of Pro Q3. Here's the low cut, fairly high at 138 Hz, and I have 3 cuts, one cut at 200 Hz, one at 500 Hz, and one at 900 Hz. So let's disable all of them, and we will listen to them one by one. Let's start with the low cut. Listen to what the low cut does.
We really need to see this through. We never want it. We really need
So you can hear this low cut gets rid of all the low end rumble that we don't need in the final mix. Then we have our 3 mid cuts at 200, 500 and 900 Hz. And obviously I adjust the frequencies depending on the vocal, and also how much I'm cutting always depends on the vocal. But usually my EQ curve really looks similar to this. Here we have the 200 cut.
To see, we really need to see this through.
You can hear that the vocal opens up with this cut, so we get rid of this muddiness and the vocal becomes clearer. The same thing with the 500 Hz cut.
We really need to see this through.
You can hear this frequency sounds a little bit nasal, and we don't want that in our vocal recording. So let's enable this EQ cut.
We really need to see this through. We never want it. We really need to.
Yeah, the vocal just sounds again a little bit more open and also less nasal. And then I have another slight cut at 900 Hz.
See this through. We never want it. We really need.
And again, this is to make the vocal a little bit more expansive, so to speak. 1K sometimes has an old radio quality to it that you absolutely don't want in your vocal recording, unless for special effects. And with these 4 EQ moves, we cleaned up the low end. Let's listen with the EQ bypassed and then with these EQ cuts.
We really need to see this through. We never want it. We really need to see this through. We never want it. We really need.
You may argue that the vocal sounds now a bit too thin. This may be true, but remember that we are listening to the vocal in solo. Later on, we will listen to the vocal in the context of the mix, and you will hear that the vocal is not too thin. So this resolved problem area 2, the low end, and now our third problem area was the dynamic range. Usually vocals are way too dynamic. We want to have very controlled dynamics for vocals so that the vocal can stay upfront and close to the listener, and we achieve that by applying compression, a ton of compression, and I also like to do some limiting on the vocals. Let's see how I do this. And actually I start off with a limiter. This is the L1 limiter. So this is the L1 from Waves, redesigned by Cornef Audio, and I really like this plugin. This is on default setting. I'm adding 3 dB of gain. And what I'm looking for with this limiter is to catch some of the peaks of the vocal so that the compressor that is coming after limiter has to work less. I'm aiming for about 3 dB of gain reduction on the loudest peaks. Listen to it with the limiter off and then on, but remember I'm adding 3 dB of gain, so the version with the limiter on sounds louder and obviously therefore better.
We really need to see this through. We never want it. We really need to see this through. We never want.
Okay, so what happens now? The loud peaks are turned down and therefore the quieter parts are coming up more. So the dynamic range gets compressed, it gets less, and the vocal can stay always up front so the listener doesn't lose any words. Next up we have the 1176 from Universal Audio, and I must admit that I almost never ever change the attack and release settings. I think these settings just work great on lead vocals. By the way, I prefer the blue stripe version on lead vocals and the black version on background vocals. I learned this from CLA, by the way. So anyway, attack at 5, and sometimes I play with the release. It is between 5.5 and 6.5. Usually it lives around there and I barely have to change it. And I really squash the vocals with this compressor. This brings up also some harmonics, so there's also some distortion going on, and that brings the vocal really up front. Listen to it without and then with this compressor engaged.
We really need to see this through. We really need this through. We never won it. We really.
You can hear the vocal is absolutely squashed, but it is controlled dynamically. So we have a nice vocal that stays at the same place if we're thinking about our mix as a sonic field. So now that our vocal is controlled, so we have the low end in place and also the dynamic range is compressed, the next thing that I like to address is the high end. Usually there are two things to address with this high end problem. The first thing is that you want to have nice airy vocals with a nice smooth top end, but also vocals have a lot of sibilance. And these sibilance can get harsh quite fast. So we want to add that nice airy top end, but at the same time we have to control the harsh sibilance. Let's take a look at how I achieve this. To achieve this, I'm using two plugins. First, a de-esser to get rid of the harsh sibilances. I'm using FabFilter Pro DS, a great de-esser. You can take a look at it and see what it is doing.
We really need to see this through. We really need to see this through.
You can hear that the T, the S, the through gets turned down so that the sibilance is not so harsh and it doesn't stand out so much. Now that we have controlled the sibilance, we can add some high end to get that nice, shiny, smooth top end. I'm doing this again with FabFilter Pro Q3 with a high shelf at 1K. But as you can see, there are also some nasty frequencies. While I'm adding high end, I also have to control it and to get rid of some of these nasty frequencies. So you can see with high end, it's really about adding as much high end as you can without making the vocal harsh. Let's disable everything and listen first just to the shelf with the cuts disabled and then with everything together.
We really need to see this through. We never won it. We really need to see this through.
You can hear that the vocal takes a step forward with that added high end, but at the same time it gets quite harsh sometimes. And for that I'm using these two EQ cuts that I will enable now.
We really need to see this through. We never won it. We really need to see won it.
Now without and then with this EQ.
We really need to see this through. We never won it. We really need to see this through.
Great, so now we have a nice top end to our vocal. So the last thing that is missing now is some ambience. And in this particular case, I just used one reverb. Usually in my mixing template there are 5 aux effects for ambience for vocals, so there are usually 2 reverbs, a shorter one and a longer one, 2 delays, again a shorter one and a longer one, and a slap delay, so a very short delay of about 100 milliseconds. But let's take a look at what I have used in this case. So here we have FabFilter Pro R. I really like this plugin, it's very flexible and it just sounds great. So let's listen to the vocal without the ambience and then with.
We really need to see this through. We never won it. We really need to see this through. We never won it. We really need to see this through. We really need to see.
So just a little touch of reverb to give the vocal some depth. And now finally, let's listen to the raw vocal in the context of the mix, and then I will add all the processing that we just did.
We really need to see this through. We never won it. We really need.
You can hear that sometimes the vocal stands out, sometimes it gets lost in the mix, and that's absolutely not what we want from the lead vocal in a mix. Now let's add the processing we just gone through to see how it sounds with all that processing in the context of the mix.
We really need to see this through. We never wanted to be abused. We never.
Now you can hear that the vocal is solid and in front, and it stays in front. No word get lost. That's because we have optimized the Q curve for the vocal, and also we have controlled the dynamic range, or you could also say that we smashed the shit out of the vocal. So these are the 5 problem areas that every vocal has, but I want to give you 2 bonus tips in this video. The first one is, maybe you find it difficult to identify the frequency ranges that are problematic for your vocal, and in this case you can use just one EQ with some fixed frequencies, and you can figure out by just listening where the problem areas are. So you pull up a channel strip, for example I will use the SSL channel strip, you set your low band to 100 Hz, your low mid band to 1K, the high mid to 3K, and the high band to 10K. With these 4 frequencies you can play around and listen to what suits your vocal best. It is difficult to explain, so I will show it to you. So I will disable the EQs that I used, and I will use here this SSL style EQ. I will reset all the bands, and as I said, low band 100 Hz, low mid band 1K, high mid 3K, and the high band at 10K. Now you can listen to the vocal, so you boost and cut them and just listen to what sounds best for your vocal. This is a simple way to EQ vocals without getting too focused on specific frequencies. This is more like a big picture shaping of the vocal that usually does a great job. So let's listen to it.
We really need to see this through. We never wanted to be abused. We really need to see this through. We never wanted. We really need to see this through. We never wanted. We really need to see this through. We never wanted. We really need to see this through. We never wanted. We really need to see this through. We never wanted. We really need to see this through.
As you saw, I limited myself to fixed frequencies on this EQ, but you also saw that with these 4 EQ moves we got a great sounding vocal pretty fast. So try it out on your next mix. Listen once again in the context of the mix. We will start with this EQ disabled.
We really need to see this through. We never wanted. We really need to see this through. We never wanted. We really need to see this.
And obviously you can always make changes to adjust it to the mix, as I did in this example. So these are my 5 quick tips for better sounding vocal, and also 1 bonus tip, but I said that you will get another bonus tip. And my second bonus tip is that with vocal recordings the performance is everything. If the performance of the vocal itself is not good, there is no way that you will have a great sounding mix at the end. Nowadays you can program drums, you can program bass, you edit the shit out of your guitars. I mean, you could also tune vocals and edit them, but let's be honest, vocals are the most important, maybe also the most human instrument in a mix, so the vocals have to be recorded properly with a great performance. If you have a subpar performance, the final mix will never ever be great. So please, take your time to get great vocal performances, because you will need a great vocal take to have a great sounding mix at the end. I hope you have enjoyed this video and that you have learned something today. If you want to learn more about music production, then please subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.